Welcome to the last meeting that we have of 2024. And starting, of course, on a little bit of a sad note, I'd like to just recognize the death a few weeks ago of Murray Sinclair, who you remember talked to us a couple of years ago on June 6th, and whose talk is in Historic Kingston for that year. And it was wonderful to have him with us, albeit on video from Winnipeg. And we remember what he said and what he was talking about, very much so at this time. On other matters, your memberships are due. At least two of us here have paid. I won't ask the other person to mention who he or she was, but, oh, Jennifer has her hand up, thank you. But please remember, Peter is, oh, and Betty as well, that's three of us. Remind the rest of you, if you could please pay that membership, and so that Peter doesn't have to come running around after you.
We have 20 actually.
Oh, and I just little person to my right of me says we have 20 people who have paid, so that is just excellent. I am reminded that we now have an account on Instagram, which will keep you up to date with various activities. And so those of you who spend time online, Kingston Historical Society with no spaces between the words should produce the Instagram account. And with Christmas coming up, the Santa Claus parade is on Friday evening. And if you look really carefully, Saturday this year, okay, Saturday evening, you will see a Murney Tower float. Remember that next year is the 100th year that we have had a museum in the Murney Tower. And so this is the beginning of those centennial events that are going to be happening. And somewhere in the parade, the Murney Tower float. A number of you know that this evening, another past June the 6th speaker, Patrice Dutil, is speaking in Toronto on his new book on John A. Macdonald's work in 1885. Actually, he's starting right now, and I was not going to put a link up to that talk because I wanted everybody to be here for John. But tomorrow it is being recorded and it will be online, and we'll put a link up so that those of you who came tonight or at home tonight watching will be able to see Patrice Dutil's latest work. And finally, the 2025 program is now up on our website. Excellent program, put together by Duncan. And Duncan, if you'd like to come now and introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening and welcome to our November lecture. It's my pleasure to introduce John Grenville as our speaker tonight. Now, John, when he was a student at Queen's, joined the Fort Henry Guard. And I could argue that through the rest of his career, he became a soldier for Canadian heritage and preservation. After graduation, he worked briefly at the fort as a research officer and then completed his education at Dalhousie and St. Mary's University, where he acquired an MA and in history and an MBA. Since then, he's had a distinguished career as a historical researcher and manager for Parks Canada, working at various sites in Canada, including the Citadel in Halifax, Bellevue House here in Kingston,
Mine is working fine.
and has also been the manager of Eastern Ontario for Parks Canada, a big bailiwick for him to cover. Since retirement, he's remained active as a really good historian, pursuing some of the things that interest him. And as you may remember, he quite recently spoke to us on the Battery Tower in Kingston Harbor. And he continues that research and reports it tonight to us about a turn of the 20th century Kingston architect and consultant, John Beckwith, Ernest Beckwith. So without further ado, I'll turn this over to John and welcome him.
Thank you very much, Duncan. It's a pleasure to be here talking about Ernest Beckwith. But before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge two people whose assistance I received in the preparation, not in the preparation, in the gathering of material for this presentation over a fairly long period of time. One of them was the late Rick Nielsen. Rick, as many of you will know, read Kingston newspapers from the beginning, 1810. And I think when he passed away, he was into the late 1920s, perhaps even into the 1930s. He was primarily looking for marine references. Whenever we spoke with him about what we were working on, he was more than willing to help, and he gave me lots of references to Mr. Beckwith. I'd also like to thank Jennifer McKendry, who's here tonight. Thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer invariably passes on little tidbits of things that she finds, but most of all, she helps me with the photography. And you'll see lots of credits for Jennifer in this presentation as we go along. And any of the images that I get from elsewhere, I give them to Jennifer, and she waves her hand over them, or does something in the computer and optimizes the images so that they are always much better than before I sent them to her. So thank you, Jennifer, for that. So tonight I'm going to talk about Ernest Ralph Beckwith, a Brit, city engineer, city architect, and plumbing inspector for the city of Kingston, an entrepreneur, a soldier and airman, but most importantly, and the focus of the presentation tonight, a professional who exercised his skills in private practice in Kingston as an architect and an engineer from 1908 to 1916. I said Beckwith was a Brit. He was born in Colchester, Essex, on the east coast of England in 1878, the eldest of 8 children. His father was listed in the British census as a ship owner and also a coal merchant operating out of Colchester. The family appears to have lived comfortably. The operation of the household had the assistance of a servant and a domestic nurse. Ernest Beckwith started as an apprentice engineer in 1895 at the age of 16. And he was apprenticing with Herbert Goodyear, the borough engineer and surveyor for the city of Colchester. His engineering apprenticeship was completed in 1898. It's unclear as to how he acquired his credentials as an architect. Even in his application letter for a position with the city of Kingston, he states, "At the beginning of the year 1901, I started in practice on my own account as a civil engineer and architect, without any reference to apprenticing with an architect." Beckwith advertises in the Colchester newspaper as an architect and surveyor in early November of 1899, and then advertises the following year not only as an architect and surveyor, but also as a civil engineer. Beckwith is listed as the architect on 73 building plans for a variety of projects ranging from sheds, sculleries, outhouses, coach houses, and minor additions, as well as plans for detached, semi-detached, and row housing, and one plan that he did for 23 cottages. All of these at the Essex Record Office, dating from 1899 to 1904. In his application, he also refers to specializing on drainage schemes, being engaged by different councils as an expert. I spent some time in Colchester on one of my visits to England and had a look at Beckwith's drawings and did a walkabout to see some of his dwellings. And right off, I'll apologize for the quality of the plans. They were stored in folded documents, and I'm probably the only one of perhaps a few, perhaps the only one, who has unfolded and tried to photograph them. As difficult as it was, I guess I kept thinking, Gee, if we had these plans for the same sort of plans for Kingston, I'd be like over the moon. But sadly, we don't. But I thought it might be interesting just to see a couple of examples of his work in Colchester, in comparison with his work in Kingston. Pay attention to the bay windows. Obviously on the left is the plan, and on the right is my photograph from the walkabout. Pay attention to the bay window. You may see them again in Kingston. You won't see that in Kingston. In April 1905, he gave up his architectural and engineering practice in Colchester, came to Canada with his wife, and was hired by Canadian Pacific Railway Company. In a short time with the CPR, he designed houses and stations. In August of 1905, Beckwith received an appointment as the assistant engineer with the Department of Marine and Fisheries in Ottawa. And although not a lot is known about Beckwith's work with marine and fisheries, the British Whig does report on Beckwith doing a being in Kingston to investigate the lighthouse fire at Falstaff Islands in late November 1905, to which he later returned to supervise the erection of the new lighthouse in the spring of 1906. In April of 1906, the city engineer resigned. The Board of Works initiated a competition for the position and received 10 applications, including one from Ernest Beckwith, who expressed an interest in returning to municipal engineering. In addition to describing his training and job experience, Beckwith also noted his membership in the Canadian Society of Civil Engineers and the Ontario Association of Architects. At the review of applications by the Board of Works, where Beckwith was recommended to council, and at the special meeting of council, there were lots of reasons provided by various councillors for not hiring Beckwith. The reasons were things like the requested rate of pay was too high, the current acting engineer was perfectly adequate, the city's work was simple. I don't know anything about simple engineering or architecture, but anyway, city's work was simple and didn't require expertise. Home talent should be appointed. No applicant was fully qualified. Beckwith had not been in Canada long enough, and not enough was known about his qualifications, and that the whole process, quote, was guided by politics pure and simple. Despite these negative comments, council voted in July of 1906 to appoint Ernest Beckwith as the city engineer, the city architect, and plumbing inspector at an annual salary of $1,500 effective immediately. According to the city budget, Beckwith was one of 3 full-time employees in the engineering department. There was the city engineer himself, his assistant engineer, and the foreman. City engineer worked with and reported to the Board of Works, a standing committee of council composed of aldermen. The Board of Works was deemed to be one of the important committees, along with the Finance Committee. According to the bylaws, the chief engineer was responsible for roads, streets, lanes, bridges, buildings, sewers, drains, culverts, wharves, and other corporate works under the control of the Board of Works. He prepared plans, specs, budgets, reports, etc., and had responsibility to carry out all engineering and construction works. Work was done either by day labor or by contract, depending on the nature of the work and the requirement for specialized labor and machinery. For example, in November 1907, the city had 50 laborers employed in constructing new drains. So these would be the 50 laborers they had, would have been working under the probably the assistant engineer and the foreman, and they would have just paid them by the day, by the hour, or whatever. They weren't city employees per se. Well, they were, but they were seasonal. They were sort of hired on, and let go at will. But the more specialized work of constructing the sewer extension into the lake near Oak Hill or Oak Street was done by contract as a more specialized job. The priority work planned and managed by Beckwith included 2 complex sewer extension projects. One was the Oak Hill sewer, and one was the Queen Street sewer. Replacement of boardwalks with concrete walks, developing plans for the stabilization of the break wall along King Street West, developing plans and priorities for rebuilding the streets, including concrete gutters, and developing plans for a plant. The plant is basically stationary machinery with which to operate, to build tar macadam roads. Council also passed 2 new bylaws for which the city engineer was responsible: the plumbing bylaw and the egress bylaw. The plumbing bylaw required Beckwith, as the plumbing inspector, to provide inspections for people with regard to reporting on their house plumbing. The egress bylaw arose as a result of significant loss of life in fires at a Chicago theater, a school in Montreal, and another school in Cleveland. The city engineer was required to inspect all public buildings, that is, general halls, churches, charitable institutions, theaters, and schools, and report on their compliance with the egress bylaw. So Beckwith went out and inspected these 60 buildings in Kingston and only found 2 of them in compliance. Fortunately for Beckwith, he left the city's employment before having to deal with the fallout arising from the enforcement side. On the 28th of February 1908, a story in the British Week was titled, "Is in a pretty mess over the purchase of a road plant. Board of Works has been ignoring the city engineer for a year and is now up against a nice little problem." The reporter wrote, quote, "The whole problem has arisen by an attempt during the past year to ignore the city engineer, who is now placed in rather an unpleasant position. It is well known that there has been friction all along between the Board of Works and the engineer. For 12 months, the engineer has been belittled by those in authority." End quote. The issue was the city's acquisition of a stone crushing plant for the road building program. Beckwith had estimated the plant would cost $7,000, which was to be covered by debentures. Tenders were called by the city engineer, but after additions were made to the specs, the final cost was in excess of $9,000. A special committee of citizens outside the Board of Works, a special committee of citizens, not the Board of Works, determined that a smaller plant could fulfill the upcoming expenditures on road building rather than a larger plant for a long-term expenditure on a road building program that was envisaged by the city engineer. The following day, Beckwith resigned his position. The British Whig, who had supported Beckwith since his appointment almost 2 years previously, reported that Mr. Beckwith has not been treated fairly and seems to have been made to understand that he was merely to do what he was ordered. The paper went on to say, "It's generally admitted, even by some members of the Board of Works, that the engineer has not been treated properly. Mr. Beckwith is a clever young man with considerable engineering ability and would have given satisfaction had he been working in harmony with as favorable a Board of Works as there was during the year of his appointment." There was a lot of, much more, now maybe there's a lot of politics now, but there seemed to be a lot of politics talked about in the newspaper. The suggestion being that he was hired under a more liberal group of men in the council and was now working under a more conservative group of men, and it was causing that was part of the problem. If you can believe everything you read in the paper. After some rumors that Beckwith would leave Kingston for work in Western Canada, he announced in the wake on the 2nd of May that he would remain in Kingston working as a consulting engineer and architect. The newspaper also had a teaser as, quote, next week he will give an interesting announcement. He has an interesting announcement to make to the public. 2 days later, the newspaper delivered the interesting announcement that the Kingston Artificial Stone and Construction Company would be formed with Beckwith as consulting engineer and J.O. Hutton as secretary treasurer. In addition to supplying a variety of concrete building blocks, the company also manufactured window lintels and sills, steps, columns, balusters, and lawn. The article also referred to plans being prepared for a row of 5 concrete dwellings, 3 detached houses, and a reinforced concrete store, all for consideration and construction in 1908. And I'll come back to the store later. After a flurry of newspaper advertisements in May and June, the company profiled the matter significantly. The advertisements list 18 Market Street as the company offices where Hutton operated a brokerage. Hutton operated a brokerage, a life insurance, and real estate firm, but the location for manufacturing the concrete blocks has not been found. The only other evidence for the operation of the company was a donation of concrete vases by Beckwith to the city in July of 1908 to decorate the market square, and donation of others as a prize for the horticultural competition in September of 1910. Presumably, this was part of the promotion and marketing for the company, and the lawn vases were manufactured by Beckwith's Artificial Stone Company. You can see them there, sort of, see one of them anyway, beside City Hall. I've blown it up on the right hand image, so you can see the vase a little more clearly. In May of 1913, a new cement manufactory appears in the newspaper and subsequently in the directory for that year. Kingston Cement Products was located at Patrick and Charles and managed by Horace Norman. A retrospective article on Mr. Norman in 1956 states that he bought the cement products company from city engineer Ernest Beckwith. So it appears that the Kingston Cement Products was the successor company to Beckwith's Artificial Stone Company. You see, yes, I did blow up here, I think, yeah. You can see the concrete block factory. It's not on the street, but in behind the houses at Patrick and Charles. While his work with the city focused almost exclusively on his engineering expertise, his time as consultant built more on his training and experience as an architect. Shortly after the Artificial Stone Company was formed, Ernest Beckwith took out what appears to be his first building permit in June of 1908 for the construction of a row of 4 units on the south side of Earl Street at the end of Aberdeen, on land owned by Alderman Robert J. Carson. I anticipate that this was one of the earliest uses of concrete blocks from the Kingston Artificial Stone and Construction Company that had been formed only months earlier. Construction began shortly after receiving the permit, so that when the property assessment was done in September of 1908, the work was listed as partially complete. And by July 1909, when entries for the 1909 directory were being compiled, the 4 dwelling units were occupied. Both Hutton, who was working with Beckwith in the Kingston Artificial Stone Company, are listed in the Kingston directory as living in 2 of the units in this row of concrete block dwellings. The area north of the concrete block row that included Aberdeen Street and Upper William from Division to University was known as the Mills Tract. It had been subdivided in 1898, and a few lots were sold, but it was not developed until 10 years later. An editorial in the Whig in 1910 noted, quote, "We advise any of those who oppose the opening of the new streets or the extension of old ones to take a walk up to Aberdeen or William Street and see the results there. What was formerly an open field on which all kinds of rubbish were dumped has now become valuable property on which a number of fine 2-story brick residences have been built. The changes within 2 years is astonishing. Aberdeen and the extension on William have become 2 of the prettiest little streets in the city." Beckwith, who at the time was living on Earl Street at the end of Aberdeen in the concrete block row house, took out some of the building permits for the Mills Tract. In 1909, in November 1909, he was issued with a building permit to construct a brick house at the corner of Aberdeen and William. The assessment records named Beckwith as the taxable person and freeholder, and the house, the assessment records showed the house was partially built by September of 1910 on the southeast corner of William and Aberdeen. Beckwith sold the property with the house still under construction to Maria Woods, but not without some adversity when he had to take her to court in June of 1911 for non-payment, presumably for some aspect of completing the house. Beckwith also took out a housing permit in April of 1912 on behalf of Harry Wilder, a jeweler and engraver, for a house on the west side of Aberdeen, just north of William Street. In September of 1912, the assessment records show the house as partially built and occupied by Harry Wilder and his family in the 1913 directory. Beckwith may have been responsible for other dwellings in the quickly developing Mills Tract. Most of the dwellings for which I have given Beckwith credit come from a newspaper reference to Beckwith obtaining the building permit. That's the house at the corner of Aberdeen and William, or Upper William as they also called it. Very straightforward, but it's important to see the picture in the sense of the bay windows that are on the second floor there. That simply shows the fire insurance plan and the location of the house. This one was a little more sophisticated. This was the one that was built for Harry Wilder, the jeweler and engraver, and he was on the opposite side, almost diagonally opposite corner on the northeast of Aberdeen, or northwest of Aberdeen and William. There are lots of newspaper references to building permits being issued, and at year end they were summarized in the newspaper, often just the street and simple description for the cladding, like brick or frame or rough cast, were mentioned, so the exact location was difficult to confirm. Even with this simple news reporting, there's no guarantee that the newspaper reported all of the building permits when they were issued. Another of the developing areas during the period was the Allen subdivision. Isaac Allen was a businessman from the village of Mississippi in the Ottawa Valley, was described by the British Whig as a, quote, wealthy Mississippi lumberman. He purchased 7 acres of land in September of 1909, and soon thereafter worked on a subdivision plan to open what became Victoria Street south of Johnson, and to open Earl Street from Collingwood to Macdonell Street. Allen's property, as you can see from this plan, didn't run all the way through to Union. It was there was a piece of property between the end, between his property and Union Street, called the Donnelly property. In 1911, the fire insurance plan shows 9 houses on the west side of Victoria Street, 4 frame and 5 brick veneer. By the end of 1912, the Daily Standard, in its article on the growth of Kingston, remarked, "In the upper section of the city, the growth is marked. This year, it's estimated that over 50 houses have been built above Frontenac Street, and there are 25 more now in the course of erection." So what do we know about these new houses on Victoria Street? The first indication of Beckwith's involvement with Isaac Allen comes from a newspaper article in April of 1910, when the British Whig notes that Beckwith, as both architect and builder, took out building permits for 2 veneered dwellings for Isaac Allen. Following week, there was an announcement that Beckwith had formed a partnership with W.H. Godwin Jr. As contracting engineers and architects. William Godwin was a masonry contractor. Although it's reported in April that they had a contract for 7 houses, the majority for Isaac Allen on Victoria Street, the partnership was short-lived and dissolved in November of 1910. However, I have no doubt that they left a number of brick houses on the west side of Victoria, north of Earl Street, as their legacy. In terms of the 2 building permits taken out in April of 1910, they were probably for 288 and 294 Victoria, shown there on the screen. Both brick veneer in the assessment records as partially built in September of 1910, 5 months after the building permits were issued. Although the partnership with Godwin was dissolved, it appears that Beckwith retained a relationship with Isaac Allen. One of the items that started my journey in the search of Ernest Beckwith was a promotional plan titled "The Isaac Allen Estate, the West Mount of Kingston." As someone who grew up on Victoria Street in the West Mount of Kingston, I take great pride in that. That showed 9 dwellings north of Earl Street and 2 structures south of Earl, all of them on the west side of Victoria Street. Plan indicates that Ernest Beckwith was the consulting architect. Though the plan is undated, based on the directories and the notation that sewer, gas, and water mains are being laid and concrete walks will be built, the plan probably dates to 1911. In addition to the location of the houses that were built and Beckwith's initials, which obviously you can't see on the screen, but I have brought the 2 plans with me that are on the table over there, and you can see them. It's a little hard to see them, but they are written. There are a lot of notations on the plan in pencil that you can see. The plan also has 2 small but interesting elevations in the upper left there. Drawings that I have no doubt were done by Beckwith. One of these sketches compares nicely to 328 Victoria, especially in terms of the bay windows. Again, so there's 328 Victoria, and you can see Beckwith's, both Beckwith's sketches actually have bay windows in them, some more elaborate than others. This house is listed in the 1910 directory as a new house and shown on the fire insurance plan for 1911 as a brick veneer dwelling. Here are some of the other structures that were built during this period in the development of the West Mount of Kingston that I've attributed to Beckwith. So you can see the similarities between them. Do all of them? Yes, all of them have balcony doors on the 2nd level. All of them have windows on the 3rd floor. And I suspect, no, they've all got a left-hand entry except for the one on the right, which is a right-hand entry, but I expect it's simply a mirror image of the other houses. We lived at 256 Victoria, which is the one on the left. When I say we, it's actually some of my sister and I hope two of my brothers that are online listening tonight. Victoria Street is one of the few streets for which we have an early streetscape. This photo is from the British Whig Industrial Edition in 1914, showing the west side of Victoria Street from the corner of Earl and Victoria, looking north towards Johnson Street. Victoria Street has been constructed and the concrete walk has been put in place. Gas and water mains have been laid. The first three houses, 2 frame and then a brick, show clearly. 10 gable ends can be counted in the photo, which is consistent with the 1913 directory, which has 10 dwellings listed. This aerial photo looking east over the Queen's Athletic Grounds in the foreground was taken by McCarthy Aero Services about 1920. So you can see where the Queen's Athletic Field was. That's the property that is now owned by the Board of Education and occupied by Winston Churchill School and school grounds. So we've got on the left there, we've got the top of the Queen's Athletic Field is Earl Street. The bottom of the field is MacDonnell, and it runs alongside the back of the houses on Victoria Street. This photo is one of a series of almost 50 aerial photos of Kingston that is in the Ontario Archives. So those are the houses, and just to the right of those houses then is where the Allen Lumber Company is. Get rid of that damn static. And you can see here on a close-up, you can see Earl Street and Collingwood Street, and you can have a little closer look at some of the houses. You can see that they're all on the west side at this point in around 1920. Allen Lumber Company. Am I losing it? Allen Lumber Company was Isaac Allen's company, who was the developer for this Westmount of Kingston. His lumber company first appears in the 1917 directory and was closed in 1962. Property was sold, and some of you who know the area know that the streetscape is now marred by early 1960s triplexes on both sides of the street. They're horrible. I hope nobody here lives in them. This oblique aerial shot was taken in 1924, looking west over Victoria Street, over the Victoria Street houses, and into the open fields beyond the Queen's Athletic Grounds. When the photo was taken, the athletic grounds have been replaced by Richardson Stadium opposite Victoria School on Union Street. The original photos are in the federal government air photo collection. The copies are in the Queen's Map collection. This shows quite clearly the open land beyond Victoria Street, and that the Allen subdivision was the western limit for the development between Johnson and Union. Went west along Union Street and the streets leading to the lake. Land was largely open except for the suburban villas and their landscape grounds. So there we have, in that area, we have Sunnyside, Lakeview, Hillcroft, Otterburn, Bellevue, Edge Hill, Spring Grove, Hawthorne Cottage, and so on, all names that many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with. I'm holding my breath. Another subdivision was announced in October of 1911 for the area called at the time both Kensington Place and Kensington Square. It included 55 building lots outlined in blue on the plan, and which is both sides of Kensington Avenue, on the east side of Center Street and the west side of Beverly Street and along Edge Hill. The land was purchased by Thomas Harrison, a Kingston furniture retailer, and W.T. Gibbard, of Napanee furniture manufacturer. Was described in the newspaper article headlined "To Beautify the City, Syndicate has an attractive proposition. Would construct Kensington Square and require superior class of houses on it." Superior class of houses meant that houses had to be built on large lots, which were more than 50, with a 50-foot frontage, set back from the lot line, built of brick or stone, not frame, and costing more than $4,000 on Kensington Avenue and $3,000 on Center Street. The street was also being laid out with a, quote, modern public boulevard, 200 feet in length and 25 feet wide, with a back lane extending from Union to Edge Hill in both blocks for the telephone and electric poles and lines. In April of 1912, Beckwith obtained building permits for 2 houses in Harrison's subdivision, one on Kensington Avenue and one on Center Street. They were both being built for Harrison, probably to show progress and to entice others with an example of what can be done. In September of 1912, when the property assessment was being done, both houses were listed as partially built. When the assessment was done in 1912, all other lots on Kensington Avenue were listed as being vacant. This photo shows the Kensington streetscape looking north from Edge Hill with the Beckwith designed house on the right-hand side. The road appears to be macadamized, but not yet paved, which was done in 1920. This would date the photograph to the sort of mid to late teens. In October, McCann Real Estate Agency was advertising McCann Real Estate Agency was advertising the house on Kensington as new brick, 9 rooms, hot water heating, large veranda on 3 sides, and you see it. You sort of see it in the photograph, the close-up of the photograph there. You see the veranda on the south side anyway, but you can see it. You can see how the veranda wraps around on the better on the fire insurance plan. The dotted line represents the veranda. So you can see that it is partly on the south side, mostly facing the street, and on the north side. So veranda on 3 sides with a fine view of the water. I'm not sure what you could say that when you were advertising in 1912, but I'm not sure that after people built the house next to them, whether you could have such a fine view of the water. But anyway, fine view of the water, cement walk, sewer, gas, etc., ready for immediate occupation. In June of 1913, Bernard Brown purchased the Kensington Avenue house from Harrison for $4,700. In terms of the house that Harrison built on Center Street, the building permit was obtained in 1912, and the assessment record shows it as partially built in September of 1912. In terms of the house that, where are we? The more modest brick dwelling has 7 rooms, hot air furnace, electric lighting, nice veranda, and building restrictions. Building restrictions on Center Street where the house had to be valued at 3,000, no less than $3,000. And it also was listed for immediate occupation in McCann's advertisement. It wasn't sold until the following year in April of 1913 to Percy Jesse, a store manager. There seemed to be a lot made of verandas, which is probably a reflection of the lack of any kind of air cooling other than the natural kind. Although I found a number of other houses for which Beckwith was the architect, the 3 subdivisions, the Mills Tract on Aberdeen, the Allen subdivision on Victoria, and the Kensington Place development were the only locations that I can confirm where Beckwith had responsibility for more than one house. In terms of single dwellings, there were a number of others. As I mentioned, because the newspaper entry often only had the street name and exterior cladding, it was difficult to pin down the location for some. In other instances, the houses were have been lost to the wrecking ball. Say for example, the house on Lower Alfred that was demolished when the street was closed and the campus was expanded. Or 2 houses on Stewart Street that were next to the University Observatory. Some can be more easily tracked when the newspaper indicates the owner for whom Beckwith is working. For example, British Whig in April of 1912 stated, E.R. Beckwith, architect, has taken out permit for a house on Earl Street for George Boyd. W. Randall is the contractor. George Boyd was a well-known cab man who, based on the fire insurance plan for 1915, operated his livery business from his house on Earl Street with stables and outbuildings behind his house. And from the look of the house, he's doing all right. If the newspaper entry for the building permit had simply said Earl Street, brick veneer, it would have been impossible, or even if the newspaper had indicated it was on the north side of Earl between Wellington and King, it might have been possible, but difficult to know with certainty which house is associated with Beckwith, especially if others were being built at the same time. However, in this instance, we are helped even more by another house. A building permit was taken out by Beckwith and Corbett for the construction of a solid brick house on the south side of Union Street at the corner of Beverly. A look at this house and that house shows remarkable similarities with the arched window, the setback for the porch and front door, and the balcony. I think we will ever know the full extent of Beckwith's work in Kingston unless his descendants have a cache of drawings yet to be discovered. We do know that he constructed at least 2 dwellings in which he lived. We've already looked at the row of concrete block dwellings on Earl Street that Beckwith built and lived in from 1910 to 1913. He also lived on the south side of Brock near Albert and on the north side of Johnson near Division, but I haven't found any connection with these dwellings and connection between these dwellings and his role as an architect. However, Beckwith lived on Cooper Street, which is a little street that runs between Collingwood and Albert, just north of Union Street. A British Whig article titled, "The Building Boom Continues and Promises to Last in Kingston," contained reference to Beckwith taking out permits for a house, a concrete bungalow on the south side of Cooper Street. The assessment record indicates that construction was barely underway by September of 1913, but by September of 1914, although still classified as partially built, it was occupied by three people, with Ernest Beckwith listed as the taxable person and freeholder. So it's the house on the left there. As for its design, well, it's quite different from Beckwith's other houses. It's similar to two houses on Victoria Street that are listed in the 1917 directory and would have been built the year before in 1916. Beckwith doesn't appear to have a business connection with Isaac Allen by this time, when these two houses on Victoria Street, this one that you see here on the right, and this one beside it. The design of the two houses, even to the, I'm not sure what you'd call it, if you look at that, the sort of decorative piece on the top of the porch on the end wall there, you see how it's arched in both of those. That's probably the original design, and I'm suggesting that Beckwith, it was part of Beckwith's design. I come to the conclusion, although they're different sized houses, I come to the conclusion that probably Beckwith. We know the one on the left is Beckwith's design, and I'm suggesting that the two others on Victoria Street are Beckwith design. So if he wasn't working for Beckwith, what might have happened? Well, if we look at the Westmount Kingston plan, I've highlighted it in red there. The plan says a dozen different designs to select from. So I'm suggesting that possible that Allen retained the designs, hopefully for which he paid Beckwith, and utilize those designs for other houses. If we're willing to accept this assumption, other houses on Victoria Street could have been constructed using Beckwith's designs after Isaac Allen was no longer using Beckwith's professional services. Most of Beckwith's buildings were residential, but he was responsible for two major buildings on Princess Street and a smaller retail building with residential above. One was the Orpheum Theatre, located on the south side of Princess, facing the end of Sydenham Street, and now part of James Reed's furniture store. In October of 1909, the British Whig wrote about the opening of the Orpheum Theatre. The new theatre was designed and built by E.R. Beckwith. It's a perfectly fireproof structure of steel reinforced with concrete. The new show house will be one of the finest vaudeville theatre, one of the finest vaudeville places in Canada, being up to date in every particular, nothing being spared that leads to the comfort of patrons. Looking at the building from the street, the newspaper speaks about the mammoth concrete columns that arise on each side of the entrance, supporting the heavy ornamental top, all in concrete as white as marble. Myriads of small electric lights will be hid among the cornices and corners of the top design. Jennifer McHenry described the building in the KHS newsletter. I quote, "The construction was modern, namely steel and concrete, but the style echoed that the classical past with ionic pilasters, lintels, and pediments." The theater had seating for an audience of 700, with a stage at one end and an orchestra pit. Fire protection was a major concern, as mentioned earlier, when Beckwith was responsible for inspecting public buildings for compliance with the egress bylaw. The newspaper notes that the ceiling is of galvanized iron sheeting, neatly decorated, and is another protection against fire. An advertisement by the Galt Art Metal Company in the trade magazine Hardware and Metal in 1911 quoted Ernest Beckwith regarding the use of Galt Art Metal for the ceiling and stage front. The ceiling and stage still survive within the furniture store. A reception hall was on the second floor and had, and I quote, one of the finest floors in the district for dancing. I think David Reed would probably allow you to go dancing up there, but it's a little crowded with the furniture. The theater remained in the purpose-built structure for a relatively brief period until about 1922, when it was sold to James Reed, who expanded to utilize the space that they still occupy today for furniture display. Current storefront, you can, if you look at the upper left, you can see the top of the stage front. In the middle there is, you can see some of the decorative elements of the stage front, and on the right, Jennifer's captured the ceiling quite nicely. So next time you go into James Reed, have a look at the ceiling and the stage, and David told me the orchestra pit's still there, covered over of course, but still there. The current storefront was designed by Bruce Downey in the early 1990s, giving it a theater-like appearance based on the remaining architectural elements. Unfortunately, Bruce had to do the new design without the assistance of photographs of the original design that do not appear to have survived. Property was designated as a heritage building in 1981. Further up Princess Street, opposite St. Andrews, is another more modest Beckwith building. The Daily Standard reported the lower part of the building will be for use as a store, and there will be 2 more stories above. The building will be constructed of reinforced concrete and will be quite ornamental in design. It's probably a building that you've seen lots of times, hundreds of times, but it's probably not a building that you would recognize as being a concrete block building. It blends nicely with the streetscape. The components that contribute to its ornamental design are the decorated string course and cornice, and the cornice is embellished and swags decorate the frieze. Beckwith continued the line of the eaves under the 2 adjoining buildings, which are 1 story less, and replicated the placement and proportions of the windows of the building on either side. Although there's no documentation on where the concrete blocks and decorative elements came from, they were probably produced by the Kingston Artificial Stone and Construction Company that was formed the year before the building was constructed. This property too has been designated by the city of Kingston as a heritage site in 1981. The other Beckwith building on the main street is the Orange Hall, located on the south side of Princess between Barrie and Division. Beckwith issued the tender call in June of 1916, demolished the existing brick structures that were on the property, and laid the cornerstone for the building in September of the same year. Construction was done by R.N.F. McFarland, the same contractor who had built the Beckwith houses on Kensington and Center Street. The building had a retail store on either side of the main entrance, and you can see the barber shop on the left-hand side there, and there's an equivalent small shop on the right-hand side of the entrance. Assembly halls behind the stores on the first floor, and lodge rooms on the second floor. When the dedication took place, the British Whig lauded the design of the building using descriptors such as, quote, one of the finest edifices in the city, quote, features that surpass even the best of them in Ontario, a splendid meeting place, and the regalia room is perhaps better than any other used for that purpose in this country. The Daily Standard was similarly complimentary with specific mention of Beckwith. The paper wrote, Architect Lieutenant, it's kind of interesting, Architect Lieutenant E.R. Beckwith, he was serving in the PWOR at the time, came in for much praise for the splendid assistance which he had given in drawing the plans and superintending the erection. Although in use for almost 60 years, by the mid-1970s, the Orange Hall had been demolished and the land became part of the property that now has the Metro grocery store. Just before he left Kingston, he worked on the LaSalle Causeway. He would have been sad. He was listed in two ways in the newspaper, one as the assistant engineer and another as the engineer in charge. Obviously building on his civil engineering expertise. So he was hired by the federal government to look after the LaSalle Causeway. Although, whether it was because of the disruption of the war, that may have resulted in a lack of work in his private practice, whether it's because of Beckwith's patriotism or simply a search for a new career, Beckwith joined the Prince of Wales Own Regiment. And in July of 1916, he reported to the infantry school in Berryfield for a 6-week training course at which he qualified for the rank of lieutenant. In December, Beckwith was employed as part of the 14th Guard that the PWOR provided to secure the internees at Fort Henry. After being struck off strength from the PWOR, although not yet in England, Beckwith was gazetted into the Royal Flying Corps in January of 1918 as a temporary second lieutenant on probation. That's quite a rank. Taking chances with a transplanted Brit who came from Canada. He went for training in Toronto in preparation for his new employment as equipment officer with the Flying Corps and left Kingston to go overseas in mid-March of 1918. Although he left Kingston in March of 1918, based on the lack of newspaper references, it appears that his private practice in engineering and architecture had come to an end about 18 months prior, ending with the construction of the Orange Hall in 1916. Following his time overseas, Beckwith returned briefly to Kingston and then back to Ottawa, where he had first lived as a transplanted Brit, working for the federal government in Natural Resources Intelligence Branch of the Department of the Interior, a section of the civil service that's now known as Natural Resources Canada. Following that, he worked as an engineer for the International Paper Company in the Ottawa area. On his retirement, Beckwith lived in Morrisburg with his daughter's family. He died in 1963 and is buried in Pinecrest Cemetery. So, as a non-architectural historian, well, really not as a historian either, because I've never really been formally trained, I'm more a digger into records than anything. Looking back on Beckwith's years in Kingston, especially the period from 1908 to 1916, we know that he designed a number of structures, most of them as brick, but several in concrete, a relatively new building material. His residential structures were modest, but many of them have stood the test of time and contributed to a number of streetscapes that were developed during his time in Kingston, such as Victoria Street, Kensington Avenue, and Aberdeen Street. Knowing more about Beckwith, who designed houses for the average resident, gives us more information about the history of Kingston and its architectural heritage. Two of his structures on Princess Street, both built of concrete, have been designated as heritage buildings. Although I'm not an architectural historian and don't have the qualifications to judge Beckwith's work or the knowledge to put him and his work in context, my sense is that he was one of several architects about which we know little that designed a type of housing, that type being the single-family detached home, that many Kingston families have lived in, and that contributes to many streetscapes in what is now the urban core of Kingston. Thank you very much.
John, thank you very much. A bit like reading the Friday real estate section in the Globe and Mail. Some of the words there, westbound of Kingston, a desirable residence, etc. So we now can look at these streets. In fact, every day I go to the gym at Queens on parked car on Aberdeen Street. Now look what I'm looking at. So we've reached the point where we would welcome questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand or let us know on Zoom that you wish to have a question, and I'll ask Craig to keep me notified if there are hands up there. Thank you. So, any questions, please?
What is the address of the Earl Street block building? Or which street is it near?
There's two on Earl Street. There was, Beckwith was associated with two of them. One was the concrete block.
Yeah.
That's right at the end of Aberdeen, and it was torn down with the construction of the Queen's big, huge athletic and recreation center. The other nice building on Earl Street is the one that the livery had the livery stables in the back, and it's at 89 Earl Street. Beckwith obviously was interested in concrete, both as something to build with and something to be in business with. And my sense is that concrete buildings have not been concrete block buildings, of which there are quite a few that have survived. Some very, very, very modest ones. But then equally some very nice houses that are very sort of scattered around. A number of them on Albert Street, Earl Street, and Frontenac Street. That all would have been developed at roughly this time. Whether there is an association with Beckwith's company or with the subsequent Kingston Cement products company, I don't know yet. But my sense is that many of those buildings have been largely ignored because they're built in concrete, not limestone. But if you look at Beckwith's store on Princess Street, opposite St. Andrew's Church, where there's a barber shop and I think food service shop of some sort. You see what it blends in so very nicely, and I think there are lots of nice houses around Kingston that have been kind of overlooked, all built early 1900s. Probably isn't any concrete building built after the First World War that I've seen anyway. And I think they deserve a look at as important buildings in Kingston.
I'm reminded that after the terrible Halifax explosion, First World War, much of Halifax was rebuilt with hydrostone, which was a man-made material, and that's acquired a kind of heritage designation now. People see it as a new wave of architecture.
No, absolutely, and the Hydrostone district in Halifax was designated a number of years ago, quite a few years ago now, probably 15 or 20, designated as a National Historic District because of the buildings and partly because of the history, but partly because of the buildings.
I'm interested in the LaSalle Causeway fact that you mentioned. Did he see the LaSalle Causeway completed, the original one?
Yes, he would have. Yeah, it was completed during the First World War, and he left really very close to the end of the First World War. He spent time overseas after the war was over until 1920, but he was here in Kingston really until he left, I think, in March of 1918. So he would have seen the development and construction of the LaSalle Causeway.
John, let me put it to you. You said you were reluctant to really set this in a context. Well, I think you have for us, and two, I might suggest. One is, of course, this was the Laurier boom that he was practicing here in Kingston. At a time when the country of Canada urbanized at a pace it had never seen before. And you touched on many things, concrete in particular, but the electrification of homes, hot air furnaces, etc., plus the kind of kudos that came with urban real estate. You want to live here because it will demonstrate your class. That's one thing I think that's very evident in his career. The second is architecture itself. I noticed in the ads he refers to himself as a civil engineer and then architect after the fact. And you implied that he comes, it's not quite clear where he acquired his skills. But I know from my own work that these are the years in which architecture became a university-centered training. McGill opens its architecture school in 1896. He seems to be in between these two worlds. And how do you react to all that?
I think he was a talented guy. I mean, he obviously learned, I mean, went through civil engineering. He's learning, going to learn, through working with the borough engineer and surveyor in Colchester. He's going to learn a lot about civil engineering, but he's also going to learn a lot about drawing. I think looking at the 73 plans are in the Essex record office in Colchester. There's some talent there. I mean, it wasn't scribbling on a fancy sheet of vellum or anything like that. I mean, it was. I think it was some interesting housing. Different. The thing is that I found interesting about it was how different the accepted British style for the time, for the same time frame, was for the Canadian time frame. So if you look at those houses, except for the bay windows, that's the only thing that I could look at. No, maybe an architectural historian like Jennifer might see something slightly differently, but except for the bay windows, that's the only thing that he said, sort of thing that he carried over. But I don't think he was self-taught, but we just don't know what he did.
Thank you. David Gordon, I see we have a question. Would you like to ask it?
Sure. Wonderful talk, John, and had me wondering about some of the houses I lived in as a student. I always thought that these brick houses from before the war in Sydenham District were coming out of pattern books.
Dave, would you speak up, please?
I always thought that these brick houses from before the First World War were coming out of pattern books. Do you have any idea that he was working with standardized designs that were published in the era?
David's just asked about the use of pattern books and whether I have any idea whether these designs may have come from pattern books. Fails me. No, I don't. This is where my lack of architectural. I mean, when you look at the houses that I know that Beckwith was responsible for, you can find other houses in other places that are remarkably similar. And I guess my question is whether it's pattern book or whether it's Beckwith. I don't know. I have no doubt. I mean, I've only talked about maybe 10 houses, I think, whereas in 5 years, I think he did 73 houses or 73 drawings anyway in Colchester. He didn't do 73 houses because some of them were outbuildings and stuff like that. But so I don't really know. And I don't know, obviously, the pattern books that he might have used. So that's a good question, but not one I can answer.
I could flip it around. When you were investigating the builders, were there other houses on the street that weren't designed by architects?
David's asking whether there were other houses that weren't designed by architects. I don't know. I was pretty focused on keyword Beckwith, and looking at aspects of development on Kensington and Victoria, but not really paying attention to the names that were associated with them. So I don't know.
We can, from my slim knowledge of it, we can see two trends here. Think of Chicago in these years where the Sears company was selling plans and prefab houses that came on a train. I think they were called craftsman houses. Order book houses. Yet at the same time, you have a young architect in Chicago working for Burnham, Frank Lloyd Wright, who initially produces houses like this, Queen Anne houses, etc., and then makes a stunning leap into an organic style, the prairie style. That's the fascination of architecture. Where do they get their gestation of their ideas and their plans, and what causes them to adopt it or break from it? I think Beckwith, from what you said, is clearly on one side of that development, providing houses that were workable, satisfactory, etc.
Yeah, I agree. I think he was. He was producing dwellings for largely the middle class, not too expensive, as inexpensive as they seem to be based on the dollar figure, but relatively inexpensive and functional. I think he was a journeyman. That's sort of where I would pick him, but I don't really have the knowledge to make those judgments.
Well, you've certainly demonstrated, I think, you've done wonderful research, painstaking research to bring this man back to life. And as I just mentioned, bring these houses into our life. I think of how many students are living in these buildings now.
Yeah.
Somebody should tell them that there's a heritage behind their buildings.
Well, just before just in that regard, one of the things that was mentioned a number of times about Kensington Avenue was how many Queen's professors lived there. And the one newspaper article talked about 6 Queen's professors had bought lots or were constructing houses on Kensington Avenue. And I can tell you as a Globe and Mail paper boy in my teens, delivering papers on Kensington Avenue, there were still lots of them then too.
Well, of course, we should remember that Kingston was in this period a walking city. We saw a few cars tonight, but you bought a house where you could walk to work, and that would apply to Queen's University professors. John, thank you for coming to us tonight. We appreciate it, and thank you for doing so much to keep this city a heritage city. Thank you very much.
No, again, for me as well, thank you, John. I omitted one thing at the beginning. For those of you who are here, next to the screen is our new banner. And Leanne, thank you so much for looking after that and getting it here. And those people who are at home, sorry, you'll have to come. Oh, there's our magician. Look at that. There he is. So there's the banner. So thank you indeed, Leanne, for that. January?
Thank you. Thank you for coming tonight. Our next lecture, at the beginning of our 2025 series, will be on Wednesday, January 15th, same time, same place, thank you, and also on Zoom, announced on our website. And whether you like it or not, you get me that night. I'll be talking about a little known aspect of Kingston's maritime history, the story of a ship built in Kingston in the First World War that sailed from Kingston, fought on the Atlantic, fought in the Pacific, was the first Allied ship to visit Bolshevik Russia, and ultimately met a very sad end on the West Coast. The lecture is called HMCS Tikval, Kingston's little ship that could. So I'd like to see you there that night, and I'll look forward to it. John.
I forgot to mention,
John,
oh, I gotta come back here.
yeah.
I forgot to mention that, I did say we lived on Victoria Street, as a family, from the mid-1950s until my parents moved out of there in the mid-1980s. And in the process, we lived next to Isaac Allen's daughter and her husband, and lived across the street from one of their sons. When Isaac Allen's daughter and her husband passed away, they were cleaning out the house that they had lived in. The son from across the road that we knew quite well said, "You're interested in old things. Would you like these plans? They kind of like deal with the houses that were built in this area." So my parents said, yes, they'd be interested in them. And when my parents passed away, I won't say I inherited them. I think I took them. My brothers and sisters, probably a sister who probably weren't as interested as I was in them. And they're on the table at the front there. So you can see Isaac Allen's, some of his, well, I'm attributing to his sketches of the little houses on Victoria Street. Thanks.